Davy Crockett was a Tennessee frontiersman and folk hero who became a legend in his own time. Davy Crockett, the celebrated hunter, congressman, and defender of the Alamo, was born in Greene County, Tennessee on August 17, 1786. He came from humble pioneer stock. He had a rough and tumble upbringing. Crockett's family struggled on the American frontier. He received virtually no formal education growing up in the wilderness where survival skills mattered more than books. Then in 1798 his father hired him out to a cattle drover, and the 12-year-old Crockett traveled hundreds of miles helping move livestock to Virginia. Davy Crockett was a child laborer who learned independence early. He ran away from home at age 13 to escape his father's debts in 1806 when settlers were pushing deeper into Native American territories. Crockett, a young man eager to prove himself, joined the Tennessee militia as a scout. Crockett fought against the Creek Indians in the 1810s when he served under Andrew Jackson. He participated in several military campaigns, and after the campaign ended he returned home to his family. He had married Polly Finley in 1806 and started a family, but tragedy struck when Polly died in 1815, leaving him with 3 young children. Within months Crockett married Elizabeth Patton, a widow with 2 children of her own. Elizabeth, along with her property, helped stabilize his frontier household. Crockett was elected as a local magistrate and then to the Tennessee state legislature. He began to develop a reputation as a plain-speaking man of the people who understood the needs of frontier families. America's western territories were expanding rapidly, and settlers needed representatives who understood their hardscrabble lives and could fight for their interests in government. Crockett was not a polished orator or an educated elite like many politicians of his day. He was a rough-hewn frontiersman, if you will, who connected with common voters through humor and authenticity. In 1827 Crockett was elected to the United States House of Representatives. 2 years later he won re-election and became one of the most colorful figures in Washington. Crockett was literally the backwoods character who rode into the capital city ready to challenge the political establishment and speak for the forgotten settlers of the frontier. In Congress Crockett championed land reform. He wanted to help poor squatters secure title to the land they worked, but his efforts were blocked by political opponents. Crockett lost legislative battle after legislative battle, but he never lost his principles. He always stood firm on what he believed was right for the common man. In 1830 Crockett broke with his former commander Andrew Jackson over Indian removal policy. Davy Crockett was an independent voice when he opposed the Indian Removal Act. He was using political courage to stand against his own party, and no one was expecting a frontiersman to take such a principled stance. Crockett opposed Jackson's policies in Congress and paid the price politically, but following that brave stand was a harsh political winter for the Tennessee congressman. Defeat at the polls was the low point. That bitter election of 1831 when he lost his seat. Crockett's strategy was all about fighting for another chance to serve. Crockett won back his congressional seat in 1833 with a narrow victory over his opponent in 1835 with another election loss. Crockett decided to leave Tennessee and head for Texas. Crockett is pulled away from his home, pulled toward the western frontier of Texas in that pivotal autumn of 1835 where revolution was brewing, and he agreed to join the cause of Texas independence to help defend this new territory. On February 8, 1836 Davy Crockett arrived at the Alamo Mission in San Antonio de Bexar. Crockett was one of roughly 200 men who volunteered to defend the fort against the Mexican army. Crockett joined the defenders at the Alamo, serving under Colonel William Travis and Jim Bowie, fighting for Texas independence from Mexico. Crockett understood that for freedom to be real freedom and for there to be self-determination and not ruled by distant governments, men had to be willing to sacrifice everything. He had to set the example of the citizen soldier who voluntarily risks his life for a cause greater than himself. On March 6, 1836 Davy Crockett died defending the Alamo. When he died he became a martyr for Texas independence. His death immortalized him as an American legend, so Crockett was even in death the unifying symbol of frontier courage and sacrifice. Now let me expand this to the full 3,200 words with the proper depth and detail that matches the original style. Davy Crockett was a Tennessee frontiersman and folk hero who became a legend in his own time. Davy Crockett, the celebrated hunter, congressman, and defender of the Alamo, was born in Greene County, Tennessee on August 17, 1786. He came from humble pioneer stock. He had a rough and tumble upbringing on the American frontier. Crockett's family struggled to make ends meet in the harsh wilderness environment. His father, John Crockett, operated a small tavern and tried various business ventures that mostly failed. He received virtually no formal education, perhaps only a few months of schooling in total. Growing up in the wilderness where survival skills mattered more than books, where hunting and tracking and reading the land were the lessons that kept you alive. Then in 1798 his father hired him out to a cattle drover named Jacob Seiler, and the 12-year-old Crockett traveled hundreds of miles helping move livestock to Virginia. It was grueling work for a Child Davy Crockett was a child laborer who learned independence and self-reliance early. He ran away from home at age 13 to escape his father's mounting debts and his violent temper. Young Davy wandered for several years working odd jobs and learning the ways of the frontier. In 1806, when settlers were pushing deeper into Native American territories and tensions were rising across the southern frontier, Crockett, a young man eager to prove himself and make his mark, joined the Tennessee militia as a scout and hunter. Crockett fought against the Creek Indians in the 1810s when he served under General Andrew Jackson. During the Creek War, he participated in several military campaigns, including the brutal Battle of Tallahatchie, and after the campaign ended in 1815, he returned home to his family in Tennessee. He had married Polly Finley in 1806 and started a family. They had 3 children together, but tragedy struck when Polly died suddenly in 1815, leaving him alone with 3 young children to raise. Within months, Crockett married Elizabeth Patton, a widow with 2 children of her own and some property. Elizabeth, along with her land and resources, helped stabilize his frontier household and gave the blended family a fresh start. Crockett was elected as a local magistrate in 1817 and then to the Tennessee State Legislature in 1821. He began to develop a reputation as a plain-speaking man of the people who understood the needs and concerns of frontier families who were struggling to build lives in the wilderness Americas. Western territories were expanding rapidly during this period, and settlers needed representatives who understood their hardscrabble lives and could fight for their interests in government halls far away in state capitals and Washington. Crockett was not a polished orator or an educated elite like many politicians of his day. He was a rough-hewn frontiersman, if you will, who connected with common voters through humor, storytelling, and raw authenticity. He told tales of his hunting exploits and made people laugh with his self-deprecating humor. In 1827, Crockett was elected to the United States House of Representatives representing Tennessee's Western District. 2 years later, he won re-election and became one of the most colorful and talked-about figures in Washington society. Crockett was literally the backwoods character who rode into the capital city ready to challenge the political establishment and speak for the forgotten settlers of the frontier. The newspapers loved writing about his frontier clothing and his plain manner of speaking. In Congress, Crockett championed land reform legislation. He wanted to help poor squatters secure legal title to the land they worked and improved, but his efforts were repeatedly blocked by political opponents who represented wealthy land speculators. Crockett lost legislative battle after legislative battle in the halls of Congress, but he never lost his principles or his commitment to the common people. He always stood firm on what he believed was right for the settlers and farmers who had elected him, even when it cost him politically. In 1830, Crockett broke dramatically with his former commander Andrew Jackson over the Indian Removal Act policy. Davy Crockett was an independent voice when he opposed the Indian Removal Act. He was using political courage to stand against his own party and the popular president, and no one was expecting a frontiersman to take such a principled stance on behalf of Native American rights. Crockett opposed Jackson's forced removal policies in Congress and paid a heavy price politically for his opposition, but following that brave stand was a harsh political winter for the Tennessee congressman when powerful Jacksonian Democrats worked to defeat him. Defeat at the polls was the low point. That bitter election of 1831 when he lost his congressional seat to a Jackson supporter. Crockett's strategy was all about fighting for another chance to serve his constituents and prove his critics wrong. Crockett won back his congressional seat in the 1833 election with a narrow victory over his opponent after a hard-fought campaign in 1835. With another election loss and growing frustration with politics, Crockett decided to leave Tennessee behind and head for Texas, where opportunity beckoned. Crockett is pulled away from his home in Tennessee, pulled toward the western frontier of Texas in that pivotal autumn of 1835, where revolution was brewing against Mexican rule, and he agreed to join the cause of Texas independence to help defend this new territory and possibly secure land for himself. On February 8, 1836, Davy Crockett arrived at the Alamo Mission in San Antonio de Bexar with a small group of Tennessee volunteers. Crockett was one of roughly 200 men who volunteered to defend the old Spanish fort against the approaching Mexican army under General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. Crockett joined the defenders at the Alamo, serving under the joint command of Colonel William Travis and the legendary Jim Bowie, fighting for Texas independence from Mexico and the right of Texans to govern themselves. Crockett understood that for freedom to be real freedom and for there to be true self-determination and not ruled by distant governments, whether in Mexico City or anywhere else, men had to be willing to sacrifice everything they had. He had to set the example of the citizen soldier who voluntarily risks his life and fortune for a cause greater than himself, for the idea that free men should govern their own affairs. On March 6, 1836, after a 13-day siege, Davy Crockett died defending the Alamo when the Mexican army overran the mission in a pre-dawn assault. When he died, he became an instant martyr for Texas. Sam Houston was a Tennessee frontiersman and a bold leader who became the father of Texas. Sam Houston, one of the most colorful figures in American history, was born in Rockbridge County, Virginia on March 2, 1793. He came from a modest but respectable family. He had a commanding presence that drew people to him. Houston's early years were marked by adventure and hardship. He received limited formal education but was educated in the ways of the frontier. When his father died in 1807, the family moved to Tennessee, where the teenage Sam would soon leave home to live among the Cherokee Indians for 3 years. Then in 1812, when war broke out between the United States and Britain, the 19-year-old Houston enlisted in the army as a private. He quickly rose through the ranks. Sam Houston was a natural warrior and leader. He fought bravely under General Andrew Jackson in the Creek War in 1814 when he led a charge against Creek warriors at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Houston was severely wounded, taking an arrow in the groin and later 2 musket balls in his shoulder. He nearly died from his wounds, but his courage caught the attention of Andrew Jackson, who would become his mentor and friend. After the war, he was promoted to lieutenant, but his military career was cut short by his wounds and ongoing health problems. In 1818, Houston resigned from the army and returned to Tennessee. Within a short time, he studied law and was admitted to the bar. He opened a legal practice in Nashville and quickly entered politics. Houston was elected to the Tennessee House of Representatives. He began to build a reputation as a passionate speaker and a defender of the common man. America was expanding westward, and ambitious men like Houston saw opportunity in the growing nation. Sam Houston was not a cautious politician or a man who avoided controversy. He was a bold risk-taker, if you will, who threw himself completely into whatever cause he championed. He was a more flamboyant character. In March 1823, Houston was elected to the United States Congress representing Tennessee. 2 years later, he was re-elected to a second term. Houston was literally the rising star who seemed destined for national greatness, with Andrew Jackson as his patron. In 1827, Houston was elected governor of Tennessee. The future seemed unlimited for this protege of President Jackson, but within months Houston's world collapsed. He married Eliza Allen in January 1829, but the marriage fell apart after only 11 weeks. Houston never fully explained what happened, but the scandal was devastating. George Houston resigned as governor and fled Tennessee. He left behind his political career, his reputation, and his dreams. He went back to live with the Cherokee who had adopted him as a young man. He married a Cherokee woman and tried to forget his former life. That painful exile lasted 3 years. Houston struggled with depression and alcoholism, but he never lost his ambition to rise again. Another day in 1832, Houston traveled to Texas, which was then part of Mexico. He was looking for a fresh start and new opportunities. Houston saw immediately that Texas was ripe for revolution. The region was filling with American settlers who chafed under Mexican rule. In 1833, Houston attended a convention of Texan colonists who were demanding reforms from the Mexican government. He quickly became a leader of the growing independence movement. Texas felt that Mexico, its governing country, was restricting its freedom and not giving it the autonomy that it deserved to chart its own course. Sam Houston was not initially calling for complete independence from Mexico, but events would soon force his hand. He was a pragmatic leader who understood when the time for compromise had passed. In October 1835, the Texas Revolution began with a skirmish at Gonzales. 1 month later, Houston was appointed Major General of the Texas Army. Houston was literally the man on horseback who rode across Texas ready to take command of the rebel forces. In March 1836, the Texas Revolution reached its crisis point. The Mexican dictator General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna led a massive army into Texas to crush the rebellion. Santa Anna's forces laid siege to the Alamo, a fortified mission in San Antonio where fewer than 200 Texan defenders held out for 13 days. Houston ordered the Alamo abandoned, but the commanders there refused to retreat. On March 6, 1836, Santa Anna's army stormed the Alamo, killing every defender, including legendary figures like Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett. The fall of the Alamo was a devastating blow. That massacre became a rallying cry for the Texas cause. Houston gathered his small army and began a strategic retreat eastward across Texas. Many Texans criticized Houston for running from the enemy. They wanted him to stand and fight, but Houston knew his army was outnumbered and poorly trained. Washington's strategy during the American Revolution had taught him that survival was more important than glory. Houston's strategy was all about making it for another day. He retreated for weeks, drawing Santa Anna deeper into Texas and away from his supply lines. The Mexican general grew overconfident, believing the Texan army was defeated and demoralized, but Houston was waiting for the right moment to strike. On April 21, 1836 Houston found his opportunity near the San Jacinto River. Santa Anna's army had camped in an exposed position between a river and a marsh. They were resting in the afternoon heat. Believing they were safe, Sam Houston was a tactical genius when he ordered the attack at 3:30 in the afternoon. He was using the element of surprise to his advantage, and no one was expecting it to happen. Houston led his men in a furious charge, shouting, "Remember the Alamo and remember Goliad." The battle lasted only 18 minutes. The Texan army killed more than 600 Mexican soldiers and captured 700 more, including Santa Anna himself. The Texans lost only 9 men killed. It was one of the most decisive victories in military history. Houston was wounded in the ankle during the battle, but he had won Texas its independence. Santa Anna was forced to sign treaties recognizing Texas as an independent republic in September 1836. With the revolution won, Houston was elected as the first president of the Republic of Texas. Houston received an overwhelming majority of the votes cast. He was the unanimous choice of the Texas people. Houston led the young republic from the Capitol in Houston, which was named in his honor. Serving as president, Houston faced enormous challenges. Texas was broke, deeply in debt, and threatened by Mexico, which refused to accept the loss of the territory. Houston understood that for the republic to survive, it needed recognition from other nations and possibly annexation by the United States. He had to build a government from nothing and defend a vast territory with limited resources. Houston served as president from 1836 to 1838 under the Texas Constitution. He could not serve consecutive terms, so he was succeeded by Mirabeau Lamar, whose policies Houston strongly opposed. Lamar spent money recklessly, fought costly wars with Native Americans, and moved the capital to Austin. Houston watched in frustration as his successor nearly bankrupted Texas. In 1841, Houston was elected president of Texas for a second term. He immediately worked to reverse Lamar's policies, cutting spending, making peace with the Indians, and seeking annexation by the United States. Houston was a pragmatic leader who believed Texas's future lay with America, not as an independent nation. He spent years lobbying for annexation, facing opposition from abolitionists in the United States who did not want another slave state admitted to the Union. Sam Houston was a slave owner. Though his views on slavery were complex, he owned slaves throughout his life, but he also maintained close relationships with Native Americans and later opposed secession. In 1844, the United States finally agreed to annex Texas with the support of President James K. Polk. On December 29, 1845, Texas officially became the 28th state of the United States. Houston was elected as one of Texas's first 2 United States senators. He served in the Senate from 1846 to 1859, representing Texas in the nation's capital during some of the most turbulent years in American history. Houston was a strong Unionist who believed in preserving the United States even as sectional tensions over slavery threatened to tear the nation apart. In the Senate, Houston took controversial positions that made him enemies. He supported the Compromise of 1850, which tried to balance the interests of free and slave states. He opposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed territories to decide the slavery question for themselves because he believed it would lead to violence and chaos. Houston was willing to stand alone against popular opinion. When he believed he was right, he voted against the interests of the South when he thought those interests threatened the Union. This made him increasingly unpopular in Texas, where pro-slavery sentiment was growing stronger. Sam Houston was not a fire-eating secessionist or a defender of slavery. Above all else, he was a nationalist who loved the Union he had fought to create. He was a more complex figure than many of his contemporaries. In 1857, Houston decided to run for governor of Texas, hoping to use that position to keep Texas in the Union. He lost that election but remained determined to fight secession. In 1859, Houston ran for governor again, and this time he won. He was elected on a Unionist platform, but events were moving beyond his control. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 triggered a crisis across the South. Southern states began seceding from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. Houston desperately tried to prevent Texas from joining the Confederacy. He argued that secession was illegal and would lead to a catastrophic war. He warned Texans that the North had more men, more factories, more resources, and would ultimately win any conflict, but the tide of secession could not be stopped. In February 1861, a Texas convention voted to secede from the Union. Houston refused to recognize the convention's authority, arguing that such a momentous decision required a vote of the people. A referendum was held, and Texans voted overwhelmingly for secession. Houston was devastated, but he accepted the will of the people. What he would not accept was swearing an oath of allegiance to the Confederacy. In March 1861, the Texas Convention demanded that all state officials take an oath to the Confederate States of America. Houston refused. When he failed to appear to take the oath, he was declared to have vacated the office of governor. Houston was removed from office and replaced by his lieutenant governor Edward Clark. It was a stunning fall from power for the man who had led Texas for so much of its history. Houston retired to his home in Huntsville, Texas. A broken and bitter man, he had lost everything fighting for a cause that had failed. The union he loved was dissolving into civil war, and Texas had rejected his leadership. But even in defeat, Houston maintained his dignity and his principles. He never wavered in his belief that secession was wrong. During his retirement, Houston watched as the Civil War unfolded. As he had predicted, the Confederacy struggled against the Dolly Madison was a charismatic First Lady and political powerhouse who helped define the role of presidential spouse in the young American Republic. Dolly Madison, wife of the fourth United States President James Madison, was born Dolly Payne in Guilford County, North Carolina on May 20, 1768. She came from a Quaker family. She had a warm and engaging personality. Dolly's early life was shaped by her family's religious convictions and their eventual move to Virginia. She was raised in the simple traditions of the Quaker faith until circumstances forced her family to relocate when she was still a child. Then in 1783, her father moved the family to Philadelphia, the bustling capital city where Dolly would come of age during the formation of the new nation. Dolly Madison experienced personal tragedy early in her adult life. In 1790, Dolly married John Todd, a Quaker lawyer in Philadelphia. They had 2 sons together, but happiness was short-lived. In 1793, a devastating yellow fever epidemic swept through Philadelphia. The disease claimed thousands of lives in a matter of months. Dolly's husband John Todd died from the fever, as did their youngest son. At 25 years old, Dolly found herself a widow with 1 surviving child. The young widow inherited property from her late husband, making her financially independent. Dolly was a beautiful woman with dark hair and striking blue eyes. Her charm and vivacity made her popular in Philadelphia society despite her Quaker upbringing, which emphasized modesty and plainness. In 1794, Dolly met James Madison through the intervention of mutual friends. Aaron Burr, who would later become vice president, arranged the introduction. James Madison was a Virginia congressman, 17 years older than Dolly, and one of the architects of the Constitution. He was a small man, standing only 5 feet 4 inches tall, quiet and scholarly by nature. Madison was immediately smitten with the vivacious young widow. Dolly was equally attracted to the brilliant statesman despite their differences in temperament and background. Their courtship was brief but intense. Within months of meeting, James Madison proposed marriage. Dolly faced a difficult decision. Marrying Madison meant leaving the Quaker faith, as the Society of Friends forbade marriage to non-Quakers. She would be expelled from the religious community that had shaped her entire life. But Dolly chose love and ambition over religious tradition. On September 15, 1794, Dolly Payne Todd married James Madison in a ceremony at her sister's home in Virginia. The marriage transformed Dolly's life completely. She was cast out of the Quaker meeting for marrying outside the faith, but she gained entry into the highest circles of American political society. James Madison was a close friend and political ally of Thomas Jefferson. When Jefferson became president in 1801, he appointed Madison as Secretary of State. The Madisons moved to the new capital city of Washington. Thomas Jefferson was a widower, and the President's House, as it was then called, had no official hostess. Jefferson asked Dolly Madison to serve as his hostess for official functions. This was Dolly's introduction to the role she would make famous. Dolly Madison understood instinctively what many politicians did not, that social gatherings could be powerful political tools. She had a gift for making people feel welcome and important regardless of their political affiliations. Dolly would remember names and personal details about guests, making each person feel valued. She dressed beautifully, often wearing turbans adorned with feathers, which became her signature style. Her Wednesday night drawing rooms became legendary in Washington society. These gatherings brought together politicians from opposing parties, diplomats from foreign nations, and prominent citizens in an atmosphere of warmth and hospitality. Dolly served refreshments, including her famous ice cream, and created spaces where political rivals could meet on neutral ground. In 1809, James Madison was elected as the 4th President of the United States. Dolly Madison became First Lady, though that title was not yet in common use. She was 40 years old and ready to transform the role of presidential spouse. The president's house was still unfinished and sparsely furnished when the Madisons moved in. Dolly took charge of redecorating and furnishing the mansion. She worked with architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe to create elegant public spaces suitable for entertaining foreign dignitaries and hosting state functions. Dolly chose crimson velvet curtains, imported furniture, and elegant decorations. She wanted the president's house to reflect the dignity and importance of the young nation. Dolly continued her Wednesday night receptions, but on a grander scale. These gatherings were open to a wide range of people, not just the political elite. Dolly believed in democratic hospitality. Anyone properly dressed could attend her receptions. She would greet each guest personally, often standing for hours to ensure everyone felt welcomed. Foreign diplomats were impressed by her grace and political acumen. Dolly had an extraordinary memory for faces and names. She could discuss politics intelligently without appearing to take partisan positions. This neutrality was strategic. By remaining personally popular across party lines, Dolly helped her husband navigate the bitter political divisions of the era. The early 19th century was a time of intense political conflict in America. The Federalists and Democratic Republicans fought bitterly over the direction of the country. Foreign policy was particularly contentious. Britain and France were at war, and both nations interfered with American shipping. James Madison faced enormous pressure as president. The British Navy was stopping American ships and forcing American sailors into British service, a practice called impressment. Western settlers wanted the government to remove Native American tribes from their lands. War hawks in Congress pushed for military action against Britain. Madison tried to avoid war through diplomacy and economic pressure, but tensions continued to escalate. In June 1812, President Madison asked Congress to declare war on Great Britain. The War of 1812 began with America poorly prepared for military conflict. The army was small and poorly trained. The Navy had only a handful of ships compared to Britain's massive fleet. Early military campaigns were disasters. American forces failed in attempts to invade Canada. The British blockaded American ports, crippling trade. Throughout these difficulties, Dolly Madison maintained her social schedule. She understood that maintaining normalcy and morale was important for the nation's spirit. Her Wednesday receptions continued. She visited wounded soldiers and worked to raise funds for military supplies. Dolly became a symbol of American resilience during wartime. By the summer of 1814, the war had turned more dangerous for the American capital. British forces had defeated Napoleon in Europe and could now focus their military might on America. A British fleet sailed into Chesapeake Bay with thousands of veteran soldiers. Their objective was Washington itself. In August 1814, British troops landed in Maryland and marched toward the capital. American militia forces attempted to stop them at Bladensburg, just outside Washington. The Battle of Bladensburg was a rout. American forces fled in panic. The road to Washington lay open to the British Army. President Madison rode out to observe the battle and nearly got caught in the retreat. He sent word to Dolly to evacuate the president's house. Dolly Madison faced the most important hours of her life. She could hear the sounds of battle in the distance. Government officials were fleeing the city in panic. Many people urged Dolly to leave immediately, but she refused to go until she had saved what she could. Dolly organized the removal of important government papers and documents. She packed up silver and other valuables. But her most famous act was saving the portrait of George Washington. A full-length portrait of the first president by Gilbert Stuart hung in the dining room. Dolly was determined that this symbol of the nation would not fall into British hands. The portrait was screwed to the wall and could not be easily removed. Dolly ordered the frame broken and the canvas cut from its stretcher. She entrusted the painting to two men who carried it away to safety. Only then did Dolly Madison flee the president's house. She climbed into her carriage with a few personal possessions and joined the stream of refugees leaving Washington. That night, August 24, 1814, British troops entered Washington. They set fire to the president's house, the Capitol building, and other government structures. The fires could be seen for miles. The British meant to humiliate America by burning its capital. But they had not counted on Dolly Madison's courage becoming a rallying point for American pride. News of Dolly's actions spread quickly through the country. While government officials and military leaders had fled in panic, the president's wife had kept her composure and saved national treasures. Dolly Madison became a hero. Her courage in the face of invasion inspired Americans and embarrassed those who had run. The British occupied Washington for only 26 hours before withdrawing. A severe thunderstorm helped extinguish the fires they had set. When the Madisons returned to Washington, they found the president's house a burnt-out shell. The Madisons moved into temporary quarters. The president's house would not be fully restored until after Madison left office. The exterior was painted white to cover the burn marks from the fire, which is why it eventually became known as the White House. The War of 1812 continued for several more months after the burning of Washington. American forces won important victories, including the successful defense of Baltimore and Andrew Jackson's victory at New Orleans. In December 1814, American and British diplomats signed the Treaty of Ghent, ending the war. News of the treaty reached America in February 1815. The war had resolved little of substance, but Americans felt they had proven themselves against the world's greatest military power. National pride surged. James Madison's presidency, which had seemed a failure during the darkest days of the war, was now viewed more favorably. Dolly Madison's popularity was at its peak. Dolly continued as First Lady through the remainder of Madison's second term. Her social gatherings resumed in the temporary executive mansion. She remained the center of Washington's social and political life. Foreign visitors continued to be impressed by her charm and intelligence. Dolly had essentially created the model for what a First Lady could be. She was not merely a hostess but a political partner to her husband, though she was always careful to work behind the scenes. She used social occasions to advance her husband's political goals. She gathered intelligence about political opponents and foreign diplomats through conversation. She helped bridge divides between feuding politicians by bringing them together in social settings. In 1817, James Madison's presidency ended. James Monroe was inaugurated as the fifth president. The Madisons retired to their plantation, Montpelier, in Virginia. Dolly was 48 years old and looking forward to a quieter life in the countryside. Montpelier was a beautiful estate with a grand house that the Madisons had expanded over the years. James Madison devoted himself to farming and to organizing his papers from his long political career. Dolly managed the household and entertained the many visitors who came to see the former president. Even in retirement, the Madisons remained important figures. People sought James Madison's wisdom on constitutional questions and political issues. But retirement brought financial difficulties. Montpelier was expensive to maintain. The plantation was not particularly profitable. James Madison's stepson, Payne Todd, Dolly's son from her first marriage, was a source of constant worry and expense. Payne had grown into an irresponsible adult with gambling debts and drinking problems. James and Dolly repeatedly paid his debts and tried to help him, draining their resources. Despite these troubles, the Madisons enjoyed their years at Montpelier. They had been married for more than 40 years and remained devoted to each other. James Madison's health began to decline in the 1830s. He suffered from rheumatism and other ailments of old age. On June 28, 1836, James Madison died at Montpelier at the age of 85. He was the last surviving member of the Constitutional Convention. Dolly was devastated by the loss of her husband. She was 68 years old and now a widow for the second time. James Madison left Dolly his estate, but also his debts. The financial situation was more precarious than Dolly had realized. Payne Todd continued to be a financial drain. Dolly tried to manage Montpelier and maintain the lifestyle she had always known, but money was increasingly scarce. She attempted to sell her husband's papers to the government, hoping they would provide financial security. In 1837, Congress purchased some of James Madison's papers for $30,000. This gave Dolly some relief, but the money did not last long. Payne's debts continued to mount. The plantation was losing money. Dolly began selling off parcels of land to raise cash. She sold furniture and other possessions. The situation became increasingly desperate. In 1844, Dolly made the difficult decision to sell Montpelier itself. She could no longer afford to maintain the estate. The sale of Montpelier broke Dolly's heart, but it was financially necessary. She moved back to Washington, where she had been so celebrated years before. Dolly returned to Washington as an elderly widow with limited means, but she was welcomed as a beloved figure from America's founding era. She purchased a small house on Lafayette Square, across from the White House. Congress purchased the remaining Madison papers, providing Dolly with some income. The government also granted her a lifetime seat in the House of Representatives gallery and franking privileges for her mail. These were honors that recognized her service to the nation. Dolly's home became a gathering place once again. Younger politicians sought her out to hear stories of the early republic. She attended social functions and remained a popular figure in Washington society. Dolly Madison bridged generations of American politics. She had known George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. She had lived through the Revolution, the Constitution, the War of 1812, and now the expansion of the nation westward. She had witnessed the growth of political parties, the rise of democracy, and the increasing tensions over slavery. Dolly herself had owned slaves throughout her life, both at Montpelier and in Washington. This was a moral contradiction she shared with many of the founding generation. She benefited from enslaved labor while helping to build a nation founded on principles of liberty and equality. In her final years, Dolly's health declined. She suffered from various ailments and became increasingly frail. But she maintained her dignity and her interest in the world around her. She followed political events and continued to receive visitors when she was able. Dolly Madison remained mentally sharp until near the end of her life. On July 12, 1849, Dolly Madison died at her home in Washington. She was 81 years old. President Zachary Taylor and his entire cabinet attended her funeral, along with members of Congress and foreign diplomats. She was buried next to James Madison at Montpelier. Dolly Madison left a complex legacy. She had transformed the role of First Lady from a purely ceremonial position into one of political and social significance. She demonstrated that a president's spouse could be a political asset and a partner in governance. She used social occasions strategically to advance political goals and bridge partisan divides. Her courage during the burning of Washington made her a national hero. She preserved important symbols of American heritage at personal risk. Dolly understood the power of symbols and the importance of morale in building national identity. But Dolly's legacy also includes the contradictions of her era. She was a slave owner who benefited from the oppression of others. She lived extravagantly while enslaved people labored to support her lifestyle. She was a woman of remarkable ability who operated within severe constraints on women's power. She could not vote or hold office, but she influenced politics through her husband and through social connections. Dolly navigated these contradictions with grace and intelligence, but they were contradictions nonetheless. She was a product of her time, with all the moral blind spots that entailed. Dolly Madison's influence extended beyond her lifetime. Future First Ladies looked to her example. She established traditions of White House entertaining that continued for generations. Her Wednesday receptions became a model for how presidents could connect with citizens and politicians in informal settings. Her attention to the symbolic importance of the presidency influenced how the office was presented to the public. The restoration of the White House after the fire incorporated many of Dolly's ideas about elegance and dignity in the executive mansion. In popular memory, Dolly Madison became an iconic figure of early American history. Stories of her saving Washington's portrait became legendary, sometimes embellished in the retelling. She was remembered as a patriot and a gracious hostess. Her personal warmth and political intelligence made her one of the most beloved figures of the founding era. Schools and streets were named after her. Her image appeared on postage stamps and currency. Montpelier was eventually restored as a historic site where visitors could learn about the Madisons and the early republic. Modern historians have worked to present a more complete picture of Dolly Madison, acknowledging both her achievements and the moral complexities of her life. She was a remarkable woman who exercised significant influence in an era when women had few formal avenues to power. She was intelligent, strategic, and politically astute. She understood how to build coalitions and bridge differences. She had genuine warmth and charm that made people like and trust her. These qualities made her an effective political partner to her husband and an important figure in her own right. At the same time, Dolly Madison's story cannot be separated from the institution of slavery that undergirded her life of privilege. The elegant parties and beautiful clothes were made possible by enslaved labor. The Madisons' wealth came from plantation agriculture worked by people held in bondage. Dolly's comfort and security depended on the oppression of others. This is an uncomfortable truth that must be acknowledged in any honest assessment of her life and legacy. Dolly Madison lived through the transformation of America from a fragile new nation to an expanding continental power. She witnessed the peaceful transfer of power between presidents and political parties, something unprecedented in world history. She saw the capital city grow from a muddy village to a proper seat of government. She experienced war and peace, triumph and tragedy, wealth and financial insecurity. Through it all, she maintained her dignity and her commitment to public service. Dolly Madison was truly a woman who helped shape the young American Republic and define what it meant to serve the nation. Tecumseh was a Shawnee warrior and visionary leader who fought to preserve Native American lands and unite the tribes against American expansion. Tecumseh, one of the most influential Native American leaders in history, was born in March 1768 near present-day Springfield, Ohio, in the heart of Shawnee Territory. He came from a prominent warrior family. He had a commanding presence and natural leadership abilities that would define his life. Tecumseh's early years were shaped by conflict and displacement as American settlers pushed westward into native lands. He was raised in the traditional ways of the Shawnee people, learning hunting, warfare, and the spiritual beliefs that would guide his vision. When Tecumseh was only 6 years old, his father Puckeshinwau, a respected Shawnee war chief, was killed by white settlers at the Battle of Point Pleasant in 1774. This traumatic loss would profoundly influence the young boy's understanding of the threat posed by American expansion. His older brother Cheesecow took responsibility for raising Tecumseh and training him in the ways of a warrior. The Revolutionary War brought further turmoil to Shawnee lands as tribes were forced to choose sides between the British and the Americans. Tecumseh grew to manhood during a period of relentless pressure on native peoples. By his teenage years, he was already participating in raids against American settlements in Kentucky and Ohio. He witnessed firsthand the destruction of native villages, the loss of hunting grounds, and the devastating impact of treaties that continuously pushed tribes westward. Unlike many warriors of his time, Tecumseh opposed the torture and killing of prisoners, believing such practices were beneath the dignity of his people. He earned respect not only for his courage in battle but for his principles and his powerful oratory skills. Tecumseh could speak with such force and conviction that he moved both his own people and even his enemies. He was not merely a warrior but a philosopher and statesman who understood that the native peoples faced an existential threat. The young Shawnee leader watched as treaty after treaty was signed and then broken by the Americans, as more land was taken, and as his people were pushed further from their ancestral territories. In the 1790s, Tecumseh fought in the Confederacy led by Little Turtle and Blue Jacket against American forces in the Northwest Territory. The Native Alliance won significant victories, including the defeat of General Arthur St. Clair in 1791, one of the worst defeats ever suffered by the United States Army at the hands of Native forces. But in 1794, the Confederacy was defeated at the Battle of Fallen Timbers by General Anthony Wayne. The subsequent Treaty of Greenville in 1795 forced native tribes to cede vast territories in Ohio and Indiana. Tecumseh refused to sign the treaty, believing that no single tribe or chief had the right to sell lands that belonged to all native peoples collectively. This conviction would become the cornerstone of his life's mission. He rejected the very concept of individual land sales and believed that the land was the common property of all tribes, given by the Great Spirit, and could not be divided or sold piecemeal. This was a radical idea that challenged both American expansion and traditional tribal governance structures. As the new century dawned, Tecumseh began to formulate his grand vision. He would unite all the Native American tribes from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico into a single confederacy powerful enough to halt American expansion. He believed that only through unity could native peoples preserve their lands, their cultures, and their way of life. This was an ambitious and unprecedented plan. The tribes spoke different languages, practiced different customs, and had histories of conflict with one another. Many had already signed treaties with the Americans and were reluctant to risk what little they had left. But Tecumseh was undeterred. He possessed a charisma and vision that transcended tribal boundaries. Around 1805, Tecumseh's younger brother Lalawethika experienced a spiritual transformation that would prove crucial to their cause. After years of alcoholism and failure, Lalawethika fell into a trance and emerged claiming to have visited the spirit world. He took the name Tenskwatawa, meaning the open door, and became known as the Prophet. Tenskwatawa preached a message of spiritual renewal, urging native peoples to reject white customs, alcohol, and Christianity, and return to traditional ways. The Prophet's religious movement attracted followers from many tribes, giving Tecumseh a spiritual foundation for his political and military confederacy. In 1808, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa established Prophetstown at the confluence of the Wabash and Tippecanoe rivers in Indiana Territory. The settlement became a gathering place for warriors and believers from numerous tribes, a symbol of pan-Indian unity. Tecumseh used Prophetstown as his base as he embarked on extensive travels to recruit tribes to his confederacy. He journeyed thousands of miles, from the Great Lakes to the Deep South, delivering impassioned speeches that called for unity and resistance. He visited the Wyandot, the Delaware, the Miami, the Potawatomi, the Winnebago, the Sac and Fox, the Kickapoo, the Creek, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw. His message was consistent and powerful: the Americans would never stop taking land unless all tribes stood together. He argued that individual treaties were illegitimate because the land belonged to all native peoples collectively, not to individual tribes or chiefs who could sell it away. Tecumseh's eloquence was legendary. Even those who opposed him acknowledged the power of his words and the force of his personality. The American territorial governor of Indiana, William Henry Harrison, recognized Tecumseh as a significant threat to American expansion. Harrison had been aggressively negotiating treaties with individual tribes, acquiring millions of acres of native land through a combination of pressure, alcohol, and exploitation of tribal divisions. In 1809, Harrison negotiated the Treaty of Fort Wayne, in which several tribes ceded 3 million acres of land in Indiana and Illinois. Tecumseh was outraged. He traveled to meet Harrison at the territorial capital of Vincennes in August 1810. The meeting was tense and dramatic. Tecumseh denounced the treaty as illegitimate and warned Harrison that he would resist any American attempts to settle the ceded lands. He declared that the land belonged to all tribes in common and that no single tribe had the authority to sell it. Harrison responded that individual tribes were sovereign and could negotiate their own treaties. The two men could not find common ground. They represented fundamentally incompatible visions of the future. Tecumseh returned the following year for another council with Harrison in July 1811, but again no agreement was reached. The Shawnee leader made it clear that he would seek British support if necessary to defend native lands. In the fall of 1811, Tecumseh embarked on his most ambitious recruiting mission, traveling south to bring the powerful Creek, Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations into his confederacy. He needed the southern tribes to create a unified front strong enough to challenge American power. While Tecumseh was away, Governor Harrison saw an opportunity to strike at Prophetstown and destroy the growing Confederacy before it could fully form. In November 1811, Harrison led an army of about 1,000 men toward Prophetstown. Tenskwatawa, left in charge and against his brother's explicit instructions to avoid conflict until the Confederacy was complete, allowed himself to be provoked into battle. The Prophet assured his warriors that his spiritual power would protect them from American bullets. On November 7, 1811, native warriors attacked Harrison's encampment near the Tippecanoe River in the early morning hours. The Battle of Tippecanoe was fierce but ultimately indecisive. Harrison's forces held their ground and the native warriors withdrew. Harrison then marched to Prophetstown and burned it to the ground, destroying the symbol of Tecumseh's Confederacy. The battle was not a decisive military victory for either side, but it was a devastating political blow to Tecumseh. Tenskwatawa's spiritual authority was shattered when his prophecies of protection proved false, and many followers abandoned the cause. When Tecumseh returned from the south and learned what had happened, he was furious with his brother. The premature battle had undermined years of careful work building the Confederacy. But Tecumseh did not abandon his vision. He continued his efforts to unite the tribes, knowing now that conflict with the Americans was inevitable. The destruction of Prophetstown and the tensions along the frontier contributed to the outbreak of the War of 1812 between the United States and Great Britain. Tecumseh saw the war as an opportunity. He allied himself and his confederacy with the British, believing they offered the best hope for checking American expansion and perhaps even creating an independent Native American state in the Northwest Territory. The British, for their part, recognized Tecumseh as a valuable ally who could mobilize significant native forces against the Americans. In the summer of 1812, Tecumseh joined British General Isaac Brock in the campaign against American forces in the Northwest. The alliance between Tecumseh and Brock was remarkably effective. The two men respected each other greatly despite their different backgrounds and cultures. In August 1812, Tecumseh and Brock achieved a stunning victory at Detroit. American General William Hull had invaded Upper Canada with a large army but then retreated to Detroit. Brock and Tecumseh laid siege to the fort. Tecumseh employed psychological warfare, having his warriors repeatedly march past the fort in view of the defenders, creating the impression of a much larger force. Hull, already nervous and indecisive, became convinced he was vastly outnumbered and feared a massacre if the fort was taken by storm. On August 16, 1812, Hull surrendered Detroit and his entire army without firing a shot. It was a humiliating defeat for the Americans and a triumphant moment for Tecumseh and the British. Brock was so impressed with Tecumseh that he reportedly gave the Shawnee leader his own military sash as a token of respect. Tecumseh and Brock seemed poised to roll back American gains in the Northwest. But the partnership was short-lived. In October 1812, Brock was killed at the Battle of Queenstown Heights. His death was a severe blow to Tecumseh, who lost not only an effective military partner but one of the few British officers who genuinely respected native peoples and their goals. Brock's successors were far less sympathetic to Tecumseh and native interests. The new British commander, General Henry Proctor, was cautious, indecisive, and dismissive of his native allies. Nevertheless, Tecumseh continued to fight alongside the British through 1813. In January 1813, a combined British and native force under Proctor and Tecumseh defeated American troops at the Battle of Frenchtown on the River Raisin in Michigan Territory. After the battle, some of Tecumseh's native allies massacred American prisoners, an act that horrified Tecumseh and violated his principles. He was not present during the massacre and condemned it when he learned of it, further demonstrating his commitment to honorable warfare. In the spring of 1813, Tecumseh participated in the siege of Fort Meigs on the Maumee River in Ohio. Despite some tactical successes, Proctor failed to take the fort, and the siege was abandoned. Tecumseh grew increasingly frustrated with Proctor's cautious leadership and unwillingness to take decisive action. The strategic situation deteriorated for the British and their native allies in the summer of 1813. American Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry defeated the British fleet on Lake Erie in September, cutting British supply lines and forcing them to abandon Detroit and retreat into Canada. Tecumseh was disgusted by the British retreat and confronted Proctor, accusing him of cowardice. In a famous speech, Tecumseh compared the British to a fat animal that carries its tail upon its back, but when affrighted, drops it between its legs and runs off. Despite his anger, Tecumseh had no choice but to retreat with the British. He knew that without British support, his confederacy could not stand alone against American forces. As the British and native forces retreated eastward through Upper Canada along the Thames River, they were pursued by an American army of about 3,500 men commanded by William Henry Harrison, Tecumseh's old adversary. Proctor wanted to continue retreating, but Tecumseh insisted they must make a stand. He told his followers that he had a premonition of his death and asked them to fight bravely. On October 5, 1813, the two forces met at the Battle of the Thames near Moraviantown in Upper Canada. The British forces, outnumbered and demoralized, collapsed quickly under the American assault. Proctor fled the battlefield early in the fighting, abandoning his native allies. Tecumseh and his warriors formed the only effective resistance, fighting fiercely from defensive positions in a swamp and wooded area. The battle was intense but brief. Tecumseh was killed during the fighting, though the exact circumstances of his death remain uncertain. Several Americans later claimed to have killed him, but no claim was ever verified. After Tecumseh fell, his warriors, realizing their leader was dead and their cause lost, withdrew from the battlefield. The Americans won a decisive victory. Tecumseh's body was never conclusively identified. His followers reportedly removed his body from the battlefield to prevent desecration, and he was buried in a secret location that has never been discovered. Some American soldiers claim to have found Tecumseh's body and even took strips of skin as souvenirs, but these claims were never proven. The mystery surrounding Tecumseh's final resting place has only added to his legend. With Tecumseh's death, his Confederacy collapsed. Without his unifying vision and charismatic leadership, the alliance of tribes fell apart. The dream of a united Native American nation capable of halting American expansion died with him on that October day in 1813. The War of 1812 continued for another year, but the native peoples of the Northwest had lost their most effective leader and their best hope for preserving their lands. In the decades following the war, the tribes were systematically pushed westward through treaties, military force, and the relentless pressure of American settlement. The vision Tecumseh had fought for, a unified native resistance to American expansion, was never realized. Individual tribes continued to resist, but they could not overcome the demographic and technological advantages of the expanding United States. By the 1840s, most native peoples east of the Mississippi had been removed to lands west of the river, fulfilling Tecumseh's darkest predictions about the fate of his people if they did not unite. Tecumseh's legacy, however, endured far beyond his death. He became a legendary figure, admired even by his enemies for his courage, his principles, and his vision. American officers who fought against him praised his military skills and his humane treatment of prisoners. His refusal to torture or kill captives set him apart from many warriors of his era and earned him respect from both sides. His powerful oratory and his dream of native unity inspired future generations of native leaders. Tecumseh represented the might-have-been of Native American history, the possibility of a different outcome if only the tribes could have overcome their divisions and stood together. He understood earlier and more clearly than most that the native peoples faced a common threat that required a common response. His vision was ultimately ahead of its time, but it was the right vision. The tragedy of Tecumseh was not that his vision was wrong, but that he could not convince enough of his people to embrace it before it was too late. Historians have recognized Tecumseh as one of the most significant Native American leaders, comparing him to figures like Pontiac and Crazy Horse. Unlike leaders who fought for their own tribes alone, Tecumseh fought for all native peoples. He transcended tribal identities to imagine a pan-Indian nation. This made him both visionary and controversial. Many tribal leaders were suspicious of his message and unwilling to surrender their autonomy to a larger confederacy. Some had already accommodated themselves to American power and saw resistance as futile. Others had traditional enmities with tribes Tecumseh was trying to unite. The cultural and linguistic diversity of native peoples, which was a source of richness, also made unity extraordinarily difficult. Tecumseh struggled against these divisions throughout his life, and ultimately they contributed to his failure. But the fact that he came as close as he did to uniting such diverse peoples is a testament to his extraordinary abilities as a leader, diplomat, and visionary. Tecumseh never married or had children, dedicating his entire life to his cause. He lived simply and rejected material wealth, focusing entirely on his mission to save his people. Those who knew him described a man of absolute integrity who lived according to his principles. He opposed alcohol, which he saw as a destructive force among native peoples. He treated enemies with respect and honor. He kept his word and expected others to do the same. These qualities made him an effective leader and earned him loyalty from his followers and respect from his enemies. William Henry Harrison, who fought against Tecumseh for years, called him one of those uncommon geniuses which spring up occasionally to produce revolutions and overturn the established order of things. This tribute from an adversary speaks to Tecumseh's remarkable character and abilities. Even as Harrison worked to destroy Tecumseh's Confederacy and expand American control over native lands, he recognized the Shawnee leader's greatness. In the years after his death, Tecumseh became an almost mythical figure in American culture. Towns, counties, and landmarks were named after him across the United States and Canada. He appeared in poems, novels, and eventually films as a noble and tragic hero. This romanticization sometimes obscured the real man and his actual goals, but it also ensured that his memory endured. For Native Americans, Tecumseh remains a symbol of resistance, pride, and the dream of unity. His vision of Native peoples standing together against colonization and displacement continues to resonate. Modern Native American activists and leaders have invoked Tecumseh's name and example in their own struggles for rights, recognition, and sovereignty. He represents what might have been possible if Native peoples had been able to overcome their divisions and present a united front against American expansion. The fact that they could not do so in Tecumseh's time does not diminish his vision or his courage in pursuing it against overwhelming odds. Tecumseh died as he lived, fighting for his people and his vision of their future. He never surrendered, never compromised his principles, and never gave up hope that Native peoples could preserve their lands and their way of life. Though his Confederacy died with him and his dream was never realized, his legacy as a leader, warrior, and visionary endures more than 2 centuries after his death. Tecumseh understood that his people faced an existential crisis and that only unity offered hope for survival. He worked tirelessly to build that unity, traveling thousands of miles, delivering countless speeches, and fighting numerous battles in service of his vision. In the end, he failed to achieve his goal, but his failure was not for lack of vision, courage, or effort. The forces arrayed against him were simply too powerful, and the divisions among Native peoples too deep to overcome in the time available. Yet Tecumseh's life and death remind us that even in defeat, there can be honor, dignity, and lasting inspiration. He was a man who saw clearly what needed to be done and dedicated everything he had to doing it, knowing the odds were against him but refusing to surrender without a fight.